Odessa Fenwick was 44 years old when she watched the last of her husband's wheat fields pass into the hands of the very company that had loaned him the seed to plant them, and understood, standing in that stripped and silent field, that she now possessed nothing but the clothes on her back and a debt she had never agreed to. It was Augustus Kell, president of the Prairie Grain Trust, who called due the seed loan her husband had co-signed years before. A loan Kell's own company had quietly structured so that a single bad harvest would hand him the very land it financed. With $12 in coin and a widow's uncertain future ahead of her, Odessa accepted, almost as a joke at her own expense, the rusted and condemned grain silo standing empty behind the trust's abandoned elevator on the edge of Halcyon Furrow, Nebraska. A structure so worthless the trust itself offered it to her for nothing, simply to clear it from their books, and she smiled and said, "Take it then," as though agreeing to inherit a headache rather than a home. They did not know that sealed behind the silo's rusted hatch, untouched for more than 20 years, waited an impossible surprise that would not only save Odessa from ruin, but would free an entire farming community from a debt it had been quietly paying for a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Fenwick. If you are watching this from a place where everything feels like it's already been decided against you, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Odessa had been born Odessa Marlowe in the spring of 1850, the daughter of a Nebraska homesteader named Franklin Marlowe, who had broken the tough prairie sod with a team of oxen and more stubbornness than sense, and a mother, Cassandra, whose own father had been a country doctor back in Ohio, and who had brought west with her a considerable knowledge of plants, both those that healed and those that merely grew. Cassandra taught her daughter early to notice what other farm families walked past without seeing. The particular resilience of a certain patch of native grass that survived a drought which killed the planted wheat around it. The way certain wild plants seemed to thrive in soil everyone else had declared worthless, and she instilled in Odessa a conviction that would shape the whole of her later life. That nature kept its own quiet records of what could endure hardship and what could not. Records far more honest than any human accounting, if only a person had the patience to read them. Franklin, for his part, taught his daughter the practical business of farming itself, how to judge soil by its smell and its color, how to save seed properly from one season's best plants to strengthen the next season's planting. A practice he insisted upon long after neighboring farmers had begun purchasing fresh seed each year from the growing commercial suppliers moving into the territory, since he believed, as his own father had taught him, that a farmer who saved her own seed retained her independence in a way that no amount of convenient commercial seed could replace. Cassandra Marlowe often reminded her daughter, while the two of them walked the fence lines identifying one plant from another, that a doctor's daughter learned early that nature rarely announced its remedies with any fanfare, that the plant which saved a fevered child's life often grew in the same unremarkable ditch as a dozen useless weeds, indistinguishable to an untrained eye, but entirely obvious to a patient one. And Odessa carried that lesson forward long after her mother's own passing, applying it not merely to medicinal herbs, but to every plant she encountered across a lifetime of farming, watching always for the quiet, unremarkable exception that revealed some hidden strength beneath its ordinary appearance. Odessa grew up walking the fields beside her mother identifying plants, and beside her father learning the patient rhythms of planting and harvest both. And by the time she reached her middle teens, she had developed an eye for observing small variations between individual wheat plants that most farmers never thought to examine closely, noticing which stalks stood straighter after a hailstorm, which showed less rust and blight in a wet season, which produced fuller heads of grain even when a dry spell stunted their neighbors. She began, almost as a private hobby encouraged gently by her mother, saving seed from these particular standout plants each season, keeping her own small experimental plot at the edge of her father's larger fields, a practice that continued quietly for years without any expectation that it might ever amount to more than a daughter's harmless curiosity about the land she loved. She married at 22, a steady young farmer named Josiah Fenwick, who had homesteaded a modest parcel adjoining her father's land, and who found in Odessa's careful attention to her plants not a curious eccentricity, but a genuine partnership he valued as much as her steady hand with the household accounts. Together they built their farm across 2 decades of hard, but generally rewarding labor. Odessa continuing her careful seed saving in a corner of their land, even as the growing town of Halcyon Furrow increasingly organized itself around the Prairie Grain Trust, a company that had arrived in the territory promising farmers modern conveniences, guaranteed seed quality, and reliable markets for their harvest in exchange for exclusive seed. Contracts that bound each farming family to purchase their planting stock fresh each season directly from the trust rather than saving their own, as Odessa's father had always insisted upon. Josiah, like most of his neighbors, eventually signed such a contract in the interest of practical convenience and the promise of better yields the trust's seed catalog advertised, though he continued to indulge Odessa's private experimental plot without complaint, understanding, in his own quiet way, that his wife's careful attention to those particular plants brought her a satisfaction he had no wish to interrupt. It was in the drought years of the middle 1880s that Odessa's quiet hobby began to reveal its true significance. For while the trust's commercially bred wheat, developed for maximum yield in favorable conditions rather than resilience in harsh ones, withered and failed across nearly every contracted farm in the county, the small experimental plot Odessa had tended for over 2 decades, descended from those original standout plants she had first noticed as a girl walking the fields. With her mother, continued to produce a modest but genuine harvest even through the worst of the dry seasons, its deeper root systems and unusual drought tolerance the product of years of careful, patient selection rather than any single dramatic discovery. Odessa began keeping careful written records of her breeding work during these years, meticulous notes on which plants she selected each season and why, a habit her mother's early lessons about nature's honest records had instilled in her decades before, though she shared the full extent of her work with almost no one beyond Josiah himself, some private instinct warning her that the trust, which profited enormously from farmers' continued dependence on its commercial seed, might not welcome news of a hardier alternative developed entirely outside its control. Josiah Fenwick's death came suddenly in the winter of 1891, a heart seizure that took him in his sleep after an otherwise ordinary day's work, and Odessa found herself, at 51 years old, a widow facing the full weight of the farm's finances for the first time in her adult life, including a seed loan Josiah had taken the previous spring to cover an expansion of their contracted acreage, a loan whose precise terms Odessa had never fully reviewed, trusting, as she had trusted, her husband in all things, that he had managed the arrangement soundly. She would soon learn how costly that trust had been, for the following season brought one of the worst droughts the territory had yet endured, and the trust's commercial wheat, planted across the vast majority of the Fenwick farm's contracted acreage, failed almost entirely, leaving Odessa unable to make the loan's scheduled payment when Augustus Kell's collection agent arrived that autumn to assess the harvest. She spent several sleepless nights in that difficult month attempting to understand exactly how such a clause had come to be included in a document Josiah had signed so readily, eventually learning from Percival Doyle, the trust's own clerk, that the company routinely presented its seed loan contracts as standard, unremarkable paperwork during the busy spring planting season, when farmers eager to secure seed before the ground warmed rarely paused to read every clause with the care such a binding document deserved, a practice Doyle admitted to Odessa with evident discomfort, though he stopped short of directly criticizing his employer's methods. Augustus Kell himself, a man Odessa had met only briefly at various trust functions over the years, but whose reputation for shrewd, unforgiving business practice was well known throughout the county, arrived at the farm personally within weeks of the failed harvest, his manner carrying a courteous surface that did nothing to disguise the cold calculation. Beneath it, informing Odessa that the loan's terms, which Josiah had signed the previous spring, included a clause allowing the trust to call the full balance due immediately upon any single season's failure to meet minimum payment, a clause that transferred the farm's deed to the trust's ownership outright should the widow prove unable to satisfy the debt in full within 30 days. Odessa asked to see the original loan document, and Kell produced it without hesitation, the clause exactly as he described it. Josiah's signature unmistakably genuine, even if its full implications had clearly never been properly explained to him at the time of signing. A common enough practice, Odessa would later learn from other struggling neighbors. In the trust's dealings with farmers eager for the promised convenience of guaranteed seed and expanded credit. She had no 30 days' worth of alternative income to draw upon, no distant relatives with resources sufficient to rescue the debt, and within the specified month, the Fenwick farm, including the small experimental plot Odessa had tended for over 2 decades, passed entirely into the Prairie Grain Trust's ownership, Kell himself noting, with what struck Odessa as genuine indifference rather than any particular malice, that the trust intended to plant the entire acreage with its own commercial seed the following spring regardless of what modest plot Odessa claimed to have cultivated there previously. Odessa Fenwick found herself, at 51 years old, standing at the edge of the very field she had walked since childhood, with $12 in coin, a small trunk of personal belongings, and a leather satchel containing 2 decades of careful breeding notes that represented, though she could not have proven it to anyone's satisfaction in that desperate hour, the only surviving evidence of her life's quiet, patient work. She had managed, in the chaos of that final month before the foreclosure took full effect, to gather a modest quantity of seed from her experimental plot before the trust surveyors arrived to formally claim the property, hiding the seed in an old flour sack among her trunk's contents. A small act of quiet defiance she performed without any clear plan for what she might do with it beyond a simple refusal to let the trust claim absolutely everything she and her mother's careful eye had built across 3 generations. It was in the weeks following the foreclosure, while Odessa was arranging modest lodging at the Halcyon Furrow boarding house and taking in mending work to sustain herself, that Kell's own clerk, a young man named Percival Doyle who had always treated Odessa with more genuine courtesy than his employer's business practices generally warranted, mentioned to her, almost in passing, that the trust was looking to finally clear an old, condemned grain silo from its property records, a structure standing empty behind the trust's original elevator that had been declared unsafe for use decades before, and that the company's board considered more trouble to demolish than to simply give away to whoever might want the land beneath it. Odessa, with little else to occupy her uncertain future and a stubborn unwillingness to leave Halcyon Furrow entirely, while some part of her still hoped to find use for the seed she had rescued, inquired further, and Doyle, after checking with the board on her behalf, returned with an offer that struck Odessa as almost insulting in its worthlessness. The trust would transfer the silo and its small surrounding plot to her outright, free of any purchase price whatsoever, simply to be rid of the liability its condemned condition represented on the company's books. Odessa, with a wry, tired smile that surprised even herself in that difficult season, told Doyle to inform the board, take it then, and signed the necessary paper the following morning. The silo itself, when Odessa walked out to examine her strange new inheritance, proved exactly as forsaken as its reputation suggested, its corrugated metal walls streaked with 2 decades of rust, its ladder rungs dangerously corroded, its upper hatch sealed shut by rust and neglect so thoroughly that Odessa initially doubted she could open it at all without proper tools. She spent her first days simply clearing the ground floor space enough to shelter from the weather, salvaging what usable lumber she could from a small collapsed shed nearby to patch the worst gaps in the silo's base. And it was on her 5th day, having finally secured a proper pry bar from a sympathetic hardware merchant willing to extend her modest credit, that she managed to work the corroded hatch mechanism loose enough to swing the heavy metal door open for what county records suggested was the first time in over 20 years. Inside, Odessa found the silo's interior remarkably dry despite its rusted exterior, the structure's original construction having apparently been sound enough to keep moisture from penetrating its inner chamber even through 2 decades of neglect. And near the base of the interior wall, tucked into a shallow recessed compartment that had clearly been built deliberately into the silo's original construction rather than added later, she found a large sealed tin container, considerably heavier than its size suggested, along with a leather document case that, when she pried it open, revealed a thick journal bound in cracked leather and a stack of correspondence tied with twine gone brittle with the passing decades. Odessa carried both the tin and the document case back to her makeshift shelter, setting them carefully on the single sturdy table she had managed to construct from salvaged lumber, and found herself hesitating for a long moment before opening either. Some instinct honed by her mother's old lessons about nature's quiet records telling her that whatever she was about to uncover would demand more of her than simple curiosity could satisfy. Odessa carried both the tin and the document case back to her makeshift shelter and worked through that first evening by lamplight, opening the tin first to discover, packed in layers of waxed paper that had preserved its contents remarkably well against moisture and pests both, a substantial quantity of wheat seed, its individual grains larger and notably different in appearance from any commercial variety Odessa had encountered in her decades of farming, seed that some instinct, honed by a lifetime of her mother's careful observation, told her immediately represented something considerably more significant than an ordinary farmer's saved harvest. The journal, once she began reading its careful, deliberate hand, confirmed her instinct beyond anything she could have anticipated, for its author identified herself as Cornelia Voss, a botanist and former agricultural researcher who had come to Halcyon Furrow in the early 1870s, years before the Prairie Grain Trust had established its dominant position in the county, and who had spent nearly a decade developing, through careful, systematic breeding remarkably similar to Odessa's own instinctive methods, a strain of wheat specifically selected for drought resistance and blight tolerance far beyond anything commercially available at the time. Odessa found herself returning again and again, in the days that followed, to a particular passage in which Cornelia described the quiet satisfaction of watching a single resilient stalk survive a hailstorm that flattened everything around it, a passage so similar in its sentiment to memories Odessa carried of her own girlhood beside her mother that she felt, reading it, an almost uncanny kinship with a woman she had never met and who had vanished from Halcyon Furrow decades before Odessa herself had begun her own quiet experiments, as though two women separated by a generation had each, independently and in isolation, arrived at the same patient understanding of what the land could teach a person willing to watch closely enough. Cornelia's journal described, in increasingly troubled entries across its later pages, how her research had drawn the attention of the newly formed Prairie Grain Trust. Then, under the leadership of Augustus Kell's own father, Silas Kell, who recognized immediately that a drought-resistant strain freely available to local farmers would undermine the trust's entire business model, which depended on farmers' continued reliance on commercial seed purchased fresh each season precisely because that seed performed poorly enough in adverse conditions to keep farmers perpetually indebted to the company's guaranteed replacement stock. Silas Kell, according to Cornelia's account, had first attempted to purchase her research outright, offering a sum Cornelia considered insultingly small given years of careful work, and when she declined, had turned to considerably less honorable methods, spreading rumors throughout the county that Cornelia's unconventional research and her status as an unmarried woman living alone represented some manner of unnatural or unchristian influence, rumors that grew steadily more damaging until Cornelia found herself effectively ostracized from the very community she had hoped her work might eventually benefit. The journal's final entries, written in a hand grown increasingly hurried and anxious, described a night when persons unknown, though Cornelia clearly suspected Kell's involvement without possessing proof sufficient to accuse him openly, set fire to the small barn where she had stored the bulk of her research notes and experimental plots, destroying years of careful documentation in a single night, though Cornelia, forewarned by some instinct of the growing dangers surrounding her work, had already moved her most essential seed stock and a duplicate set of records into the abandoned grain silo behind the trust's own elevator, reasoning, with what Odessa now recognized as considerable irony, that the last place Kell would think to search for her hidden research was a structure belonging to his own company. Cornelia's final entry, dated only days after the fire, indicated her intention to leave Halcyon Furrow entirely, fearing further and more direct danger to her person, and expressing her hope that someday someone might find what she had hidden and understand its true value to farmers who deserved better than perpetual dependence on a company more interested in profit than in their genuine welfare. County records Odessa later consulted confirmed that Cornelia Voss had indeed departed the territory within the month, her subsequent fate entirely unknown to anyone still living in Halcyon Furrow. Odessa sat with Cornelia's journal and the preserved seed for the better part of 2 days, understanding with a slowly building and increasingly furious clarity that she now possessed something considerably larger than a private curiosity's harmless hobby, that the drought-resistant strain Cornelia had developed, remarkably compatible in its essential qualities with the very seed Odessa had independently rescued from her own experimental plot, represented a genuine agricultural breakthrough, that the Prairie Grain Trust, under 2 successive generations of Kell family leadership, had suppressed through intimidation and outright arson rather than see its own profitable business model threatened. She understood, too, the bitter symmetry of her own situation, that Augustus Kell had foreclosed on her farm, using precisely the kind of predatory seed contract his father had once fought to protect against exactly the innovation Odessa now held in her hands, a fraud spanning 2 generations that had cost the county's farmers untold seasons of unnecessary hardship in the service of one family's continued profit. She did not act rashly, understanding, from her own recent painful experience, with Kell's smooth legal maneuvering, that Cornelia's journal alone, however compelling, constituted the private account of a woman who could no longer be found to testify to its truth, and that considerably more would be needed before she could safely challenge a family as entrenched in halcyon furrows affairs as the Kells had become across 2 generations. Through the following weeks, even as she began quietly planting a portion of the rescued seed in the small plot of ground surrounding her new silo home, Odessa spent her evenings researching what she could of Cornelia Voss's history, writing careful letters to the Territorial Agricultural Society in Lincoln requesting whatever records might survive documenting Cornelia's early research, and making discreet inquiries among the county's older residents who might remember the reclusive botanist or the barn fire that had driven her from the territory. It was through one such inquiry that Odessa located Marguerite Poole, an elderly woman who had worked briefly as a hired girl in Cornelia's household during the years before the fire, and who remembered vividly the growing hostility that had surrounded her former employer in those final months. Hostility Marguerite had always assumed sprang from simple small-town suspicion of an unconventional woman rather than any deliberate campaign, until Odessa's careful questions revealed the fuller, darker context Marguerite had never previously considered. Marguerite's memories, combined with a reply that eventually arrived from the Lincoln Agricultural Society, confirming that Cornelia Voss had indeed corresponded with territorial researchers regarding an unusually promising drought-resistant wheat variety, before her correspondence simply ceased in the mid-1870s, provided Odessa with precisely the kind of corroborating evidence that transformed Cornelia's private journal from an unprovable accusation into a documented historical pattern. Word inevitably reached Augustus Kell that the widow he had so recently dispossessed was making unusual inquiries about the trust's early history, and a long-vanished botanist few in the county still remembered, and he rode out to the old silo himself on a cold autumn afternoon, his manner carrying none of the courteous indifference he had shown during the foreclosure, but instead a barely restrained agitation that told Odessa, more plainly than any words could have, exactly how much he understood might be at stake should the full truth of his father's suppression campaign become known. He informed her, with considerably less politeness than his usual business dealings required, that continuing to spread old rumors about the trust's founding history would only invite further trouble upon a woman already reduced to a condemned grain silo. A threat Odessa met with the same patient composure her mother's careful observation of enduring plants had modeled for her decades before, understanding that a woman who had already lost everything Kell could threaten to take possessed, in that very loss, an unexpected freedom from his usual leverage. She told him plainly that she intended to plant her rescued seed regardless of his objections, and to let the harvest itself speak whatever truth needed speaking, and watched him ride away with considerably less composure than he had arrived with. Percival Doyle, the trust's own clerk who had first arranged the silo's transfer to Odessa with such evident discomfort at his employer's business practices, proved an unexpectedly steady source of quiet support through these difficult weeks, passing along, whenever he safely could, small pieces of information about the trust's internal dealings that helped Odessa understand exactly how deeply the seed contract's predatory structure had been woven into the company's standard practice, though he took considerable care never to be seen doing so, understanding, as Odessa did, exactly what risk to his own livelihood such quiet loyalty represented. The wider town, when word spread that the dispossessed widow Fenwick was cultivating some manner of unusual wheat behind the old condemned silo, proved initially skeptical, since Augustus Kell remained a powerful and generally respected figure throughout the county, his trust seed and credit still the foundation of nearly every farming family's operation, and it seemed, to most who heard the rumors, far more plausible that grief and reduced circumstances had led Odessa toward some manner of harmless but ultimately futile experiment than that she had stumbled upon a genuine alternative to the trust's commercial seed. Several of Odessa's old neighbors regarded her with polite but distant skepticism through that first planting season, uncertain whether her small plot represented anything beyond a widow's understandable but misguided attempt to salvage some purpose from her reduced circumstances, and it took every measure of patience Odessa's parents had instilled in her. Her mother's faith in nature's honest records and her father's willingness to wait full seasons for careful work to bear proper fruit. 2. Endure that season of quiet doubt without abandoning her efforts. What finally turned the county's skepticism into genuine attention was the harvest itself, for the following summer brought another severe drought that devastated the trust's commercial wheat across nearly every contracted farm in the county exactly as it had the year Josiah's loan came due, while Odessa's modest plot, planted with the combined seed stock she had rescued from her own experimental work and Cornelia Voss's carefully preserved research, produced a genuine and substantial harvest that stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the withered fields surrounding it, a contrast neighboring farmers could not help but notice as they rode past the old silo on their way into town. Several farmers, desperate enough after a second ruinous season to set aside their earlier skepticism, approached Odessa directly asking whether she might share some portion of her seed for their own struggling fields. And Odessa, understanding that the moment had finally arrived to make Cornelia Voss's suppressed research fully and permanently public, brought her evidence, the journal, the corroborating Agricultural Society correspondence, and Marguerite Poole's testimony regarding the barn fire before Judge Harriet Colby, the circuit judge whose reputation for careful fairness had reached even the county's most remote farms. Judge Colby, recognizing the unusual significance of evidence documenting a suppressed agricultural innovation spanning 2 generations of the same family's business practice, spent the better part of a month verifying what Odessa had assembled, corresponding with the Lincoln Agricultural Society and interviewing Marguerite Poole directly, before announcing a formal public inquiry into both the historical circumstances of Cornelia Voss's departure and the more immediate question of whether the Prairie Grain Trust seed contracts, structured as they were to profit from farmers' repeated crop failures, constituted a form of predatory practice deserving of legal remedy. The inquiry, held in Halcyon Furrow's largest hall because word of its unusual scope drew farmers from across the county, exposed before the assembled crowd the full pattern of Kell family suppression, from Silas Kell's original campaign against Cornelia Voss through Augustus Kell's own continued reliance on seed contracts structured to profit from exactly the crop failures his family's suppressed research might have prevented. Judge Colby ruled that while the original arson could not be prosecuted after so many years, the trust's existing seed contracts were void as against public policy given their demonstrably predatory structure, and ordered that Odessa's rescued seed stock, thoroughly documented as Cornelia Voss's original suppressed research, be made freely available to any farmer in the county who wished to plant it, free of any contract or fee whatsoever. Odessa could have sought, in that moment, to control the valuable seed stock for her own considerable profit, understanding better than anyone the genuine value of what she now controlled. And there were those who suggested she might reasonably do exactly that after everything she had endured to bring the truth to light. Instead, standing before the gathered farmers in the same plain dress she had worn the day, she smiled and told Augustus Kell's clerk to take the silo then. Odessa announced that she intended to share Cornelia Voss's seed freely with any family willing to plant it, asking only that each farmer who benefited save a portion of their own harvest each season to share further with their neighbors. Precisely the practice of careful seed saving her own father had taught her decades before, ensuring that no single company could ever again hold the county's farmers hostage to seed they could otherwise grow honestly for themselves. It was, the county would say for years afterward, a decision that revealed more about her character than any accusation against Kell ever could have. And it was that quiet generosity, more than the vindication itself, that finally transformed Halcyon Furrow's wary skepticism into something like genuine gratitude. In the seasons that followed, Cornelia Voss's drought-resistant strain spread across the county through exactly the informal network of shared seed Odessa had envisioned, freeing dozens of farming families from the trust's predatory contracts and providing a genuine measure of security against droughts that had once threatened to ruin them entirely. The county agricultural fair that following autumn included, for the first time in its history, a small exhibit dedicated to Cornelia Voss's original research, assembled from Odessa's careful documentation and featuring a modest portrait Marguerite Poole helped commission from her own aging memory of the botanist's face, a gesture that struck many who attended as long overdue recognition for a woman the county had once allowed to be driven away in disgrace rather than celebrated for the genuine gift her patient work represented. Augustus Kell, his trust's business model fundamentally undermined by the very seed his own father had once tried to suppress through arson and slander, found his considerable influence throughout the county diminished substantially in the years that followed, and though he retained his personal fortune, he never again commanded the same unquestioned deference from farmers who now understood precisely what his family's profit had once cost a woman named Cornelia Voss, wherever she might have eventually settled after fleeing the only home she had known. It is worth remembering, as this story draws toward its close, that Odessa Fenwick stood at the edge of her own lost fields with $12 and a satchel of breeding notes, dispossessed by a company that believed a widow's careful lifetime of quiet agricultural observation carried no weight against a cleverly structured seed contract. She accepted, with a tired smile that cost her more than it appeared to at the time, a condemned grain silo the trust itself considered worthless, because some deep, inherited instinct, passed down from a mother who trusted nature's honest records and a father who trusted the patient practice of saving one season's best seed for the next, told her that very little in this world is truly worthless simply because someone with more power has declared it so. Behind that rusted hatch waited not a fortune meant for her alone, but the long-suppressed research of another woman wronged by the very same family, research that, once finally brought into the light, freed an entire farming county from a debt of dependence it had been quietly paying for 2 generations. She often said, in the years that followed, whenever a visitor asked how she had known to trust a handful of strange, oversized seed found in a rusted silo, that she had simply done what her mother taught her to do with any unfamiliar plant along a fence line, which was to look closely before deciding whether it deserved to be pulled up or given room to grow. Odessa Fenwick spent the remainder of her years at the restored silo, which the county eventually helped repair properly into a genuine seed storage facility serving farmers throughout the region, respected at last not as a dispossessed widow, but as the woman whose patient faith in a rescued handful of seed had given Halcyon Furrow back both its agricultural independence and the forgotten legacy of Cornelia Voss, whose name Odessa insisted be spoken alongside her own whenever the county's farmers told the story of how their fields finally learned to survive the driest seasons. Before you click away, think about this for just 10 seconds. If Odessa had listened to everyone around her, She would have walked away from that rusty hatch just like everyone else did. No questions, no curiosity, no second glance, and an entire community would have lost something priceless. That's how life works far more often than we realize. The biggest opportunities rarely announce themselves. They don't sparkle. They don't trend. They don't come with guarantees. Most of the time, they look like old ideas, forgotten places, broken dreams, or people the world has already written off. But every once in a while, someone looks closer. Someone refuses to follow the crowd. Someone believes there's more beneath the surface. And everything changes. If Odessa's journey reminded you that hope can hide in the most unexpected places, help this message reach someone else today. Hit the like button, share this video with a friend or family member, and let YouTube know this is a story worth spreading. Every click helps these incredible stories reach thousands more people who may need this exact reminder today. Now it's your turn. We want this comment section to become a place filled with incredible real-life stories. Tell us, what's something everyone else thought was worthless, but you saw its true value? Maybe it was an abandoned house, an old photograph, a forgotten business idea, a broken relationship, or maybe it was a person that everyone else had already given up on. Drop your story below. We read as many comments as possible, and your experience could inspire someone who's on the verge of giving up. And if you're not already part of this family, this is the perfect time to subscribe. Because every week, we uncover unbelievable stories of hidden fortunes, forgotten heroes, shocking discoveries, impossible second chances, and ordinary people whose courage changed everything. If today's story surprised you, trust us, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story might completely change the way you see the world. Odessa proves something we'll never forget. Rust doesn't always mean ruin. Silence doesn't always mean emptiness. And what the world abandons sometimes becomes the very thing that saves it. So as you leave this video today, take one more look at the overlooked parts of your own life. That dream you almost abandoned. That opportunity you thought had passed. That person everyone else ignored. Or maybe the version of yourself you've stopped believing in. Because history has a funny way of rewarding the people who look where nobody else is willing to look. Thank you for watching until the very end. Your time means more than you know. Stay curious. Stay hopeful. Keep looking beneath the surface. Because the next hidden treasure might already be waiting for you. We'll see you in the next story.